is that your church needs you to be emotionally and spiritually healthy more than they need you to be productive.
I don't have any kids. All you four do.
You said you had a dog that was like your kid.
I do have a dog, but I mean, you
That
don't
doesn't
create
count.
children. So, at least, I mean, hopefully we don't. Anyways, so I want to talk about family ministry balance. If there's one thing I'm very self-aware of, the more I've done ministry is that when I'm passionate about an upcoming sermon or project or whatever, there's no boundaries. Like I will work all kinds of hours. I will bring my work home, and so to have that consistency of having a balance is somewhat difficult for me. But since I don't have kids, that there's a little bit more freedom for me. But that's probably not necessarily true for you guys. And I would love to know, and maybe our listeners have some thoughts or questions about this, is how do you keep a good work and ministry and personal life balance? Therefore, you're protecting your kids and your spouse.
I could jump in here. I'm not a huge fan of the word balance because that says that we do this much ministry, then this much family, and then maybe at the end of the day, this gets
it's a misnomer. I agree.
Scales, because there are seasons of ministry that are going to be heavy, and my family knows that they're going to be heavy seasons of ministry, and then they also know that there are going to be seasons where I'm going to see daddy a whole lot more than other kids get to see their daddy. And so I see it as more of a rhythm in ministry and not necessarily a balance.
That's good.
In family and ministry. So for me, I do have boundaries in place like many of you do. I do have a protected day off. I do try to get off my cell phone when I'm with my family. And there's little things like that. But I think that the bigger piece here is not that it's I do this much family and then this much ministry. It's that I know and my family now knows that, hey, there are seasons where daddy's going to be not as present. And then there's going to be times where we're going to get a whole lot of daddy that's really, really awesome.
Yeah, sharing your schedule. Oh, go ahead, Andrew. You want to talk?
Oh, I was just going to say, some of the best ministry relationship advice is from Toby and Jim talking on The Office when Jim and Pam were going through their tough spot there in season 9. And it was kind of like if she says, if she could tough this out, it's going to be so great for our family. And Toby, who we all hate him, but he says something brilliant to the extent of, well, how long? It's kind of difficult to ask someone to be miserable indefinitely. And so, there are seasons, and there are times when 40 hours a week, man, I wish.
Right.
But to communicate to your family, hey, for the next 3 weeks, this, and this has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But once this is done, once we get to this point, we'll be able to do this, and this that we can't do now. Or we'll be able to, do this that we haven't been doing then. This church during a global pandemic caused a whole lot of extra hours and different kinds of hours here at the beginning. And then the past couple weeks, we were in Arkansas for 2 weeks and then came back and then just took off and did Disney for several days in the middle of a work week because there's the flexibility in ministry to do that. Where it was, yes, we worked really, really hard and things were chaotic, but we're also going to do this other extra stuff that we couldn't do. And so I think kind of, a timestamp on here is how long the crazy is going to last. And then once this crazy is done, we're going to take extra recovery time, more so than just a 1-day Sabbath or more so than just the guaranteed 2 weeks that you get in your contract or whatever your employment agreement is. And so, number one for us is to put a timestamp on whatever difficulty is going to be in. And then also just to let the kids be a part of whatever you're doing. It's daddy is a pastor, therefore we get to.
Right.
My kids think it is so cool to invite their friends into dad's office. And part of that is the church that I grew up in, the pastor's office was this mausoleum looking room that you couldn't touch anything, and the only time anyone ever went in there was to get yelled at for something. And so my kids get to invite their friends into daddy's office, and it becomes the post-church playground. I don't know how many things have been broken or how many Legos have been stepped on after church, a couple days later because kids were building something in here. but to invite the children into the process of, hey, if we're going to be here a lot, you're going to be here as well, and you get to do some extra things at the church that most other kids don't get a chance to do. If you want to sing Moana with the church sound system, we can turn on that sound
That's
system
awesome.
and
Yep.
crank it up. You get access to things that other kids don't get access to because of what Daddy does.
Yeah, that's good.
I found in my family that you love your family well through helpful information. Like for me, this is some stuff you might need to know that's coming that's helpful. For me, a lot of times Sunday night when I get in, I say, hey, just so you know, Thursday night is my long night this week, and Tuesday is my early day. And for me, like, you love them through helpful information, but the double-edged sword is you can hurt them through too much information, right? So like, man, there's sometimes it's just tough, and you come home and it's hard to like leave that. And actually, my father-in-law, of all people, gave me this great advice, and it's actually very good. He says he went and visited a pastor friend of his house one time, at his house one time, and outside the house there was a tree, and it was just the bark was worn off of it. And he's like, "Why is the bark worn off the tree?" He goes, "That's my problems tree." He said, "Every day when I get off work, I pass this tree to go into my house. I touch the tree, and that is me checking in." And like, I leave my problems on that tree, and the next day when I walk out and go back to work, I touch it again. That's my way of it's like an emotional but a very like real thing. And I thought that was a really good way to help me like not bring too much information at home. One of the ways I do to protect that, and I realize this may not be possible for a lot of people, but one of the things is, for the most part, I don't work at home. I don't. Like, the only thing I do at home is once the kids and my wife are asleep, I will edit this podcast, but that is fun because I love playing you guys back and forth. Look at your beautiful faces, but just, I don't. And like, I even have a little office, but it's more like the man cave where my son likes to come in and play virtual reality. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't, because I'm a 3W2, so I'm like, I got to be the cheerleader even at home. I have a hard time shutting it off. So for me, having, like, I know when I walk in here, this is a protected place for me, then that helps me out. And then one other thing we do, and it's kind of a staff thing, and it's led from the top, and my pastor actually gave me permission to do this, my pastor over me. He says, listen, 2 nights a week. You give the Lord 2 nights a week, but the rest of the nights you need to be home with your family. He helps us protect that. And then, like you said, it's a ministry season. So like, if it's VBS week, well, you know what I'm saying? But like, if it's a regular week and I'm having to push more than 2, then I have to answer to my wife because I've let her know that.
I think for me, my temptation is to always add a little bit more. I call it like I'll just do this real quick disease. Where I'm like, oh, I can just do this real quick. And before I know it, I'm working like every night and every morning. So I think the principle underneath all of this conversation, because for me, this is what I have to remind myself. Your church needs you to be emotionally and spiritually healthy more than they need you to be productive. They need you to be productive, but your church needs a healthy leader more than it needs you to be some version of productivity that we worship as an idol in this country. We worship the idol of progress and productivity, but at the expense of health. And how many leaders of big ministries have you seen burn themselves out or do something stupid? And so, like, I would rather be a healthy leader who stays in my church for 30, 40 years, retires happy, my kids love the Lord, and we have a great family than to build some big ministry. Like, it's not worth it to me because and I think one of the ways that I've seen pastors like kind of fail at this, and where I see the danger, is like the emotional availability that you have for your wife and your children. And I mean, in 1 Timothy, we're told, if you don't provide for your family, you're worse than an unbeliever and basically disqualified for ministry. But I think we read that and we only think of financial provision. But there is provision that comes, and I'm speaking as a guy, as the husband and kind of the father in the home. There is a provision of your healthy emotional presence to your family, that if you are not providing that, I think that you might need to grapple with the reality that you might be disqualified from ministry, because the home is the proving ground for ministry life. And single guys, that doesn't exclude you, but I'm just saying, I think there's more to, if you can't provide for your family, there's more to that than just finances. I do think, there's something there with finances, and that's a whole nother conversation. And my wife was the bread earner for a number of years when we first got married, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, for me, the principle has to come back to, like, your family is your first ministry. And if you don't do that well, if you are willing to sacrifice that ministry for the sake of, your church, I think that's, you're flipping things upside down, because if you're a healthy leader in your home and you're a healthy leader at church, that's going to be far better for your church, than you being extra productive and, kind of burning your soul out. So practically speaking, what I do is, again, I totally agree with what I think all of you have said. It's seasonal. Like, ministry is not, it's just, there's seasons, not only in seasons in ministry, but seasons in life. I have small kids right now in the home. So I have a daughter that's 5. When we were doing foster care in Florida, we had 3 kids at one point. And so, like, I have small children, which means there's specific needs that small kids have. I know all of us follow a guy like Carey Nieuwhof, and we're like, how in the world is he writing this much? And, well, all his kids are grown and probably out of the house, and, like, they're older, so they don't require time with them to learn how to ride their bike or whatever, and changing diapers and stuff. That's the season that I'm in. And that's the season most of us are in on this podcast with kids. I think most of your kids are pretty young, right? So they just require a specific, emotional presence from you and all that. And so for me, like, I realized in this church, nobody cares where I'm at in the morning in the church. So I come into the office a little later. Now, sometimes I'll get up real early and come into the office from like 6 to 8. And then I'll go home like at 8:30, eat breakfast with my wife and my daughter. And then I'll come back to the office at like 9:30. And, like, nobody misses it. And so that's a way I've protected family time. And then I'm a couple nights a week doing a class or something. And I love whoever said, involve your kids. Andrew, that was you, I guess. Involve your kids. I mean, my daughter's the same way. I live in a parsonage, so if I'm walking out of the house to walk to my office, she's always asking, like, can I come to your office? Can I come hang out? And so, and she's singing in the microphones and playing the drums in the church and all that. So, I just think it's a matter of, like, prioritizing your health, because the position that you're in your church is, like, you need to be healthy to be in that position. You can't be unhealthy in your soul and lead other people and shepherd people.
So can I get under that with one more, like, fundamental question? Because I know that there are people right now who they don't have children yet, or maybe they're not married, but there is something I wish I would have done before all of that would have helped me a lot. And all of you have been saying it in your own way, but it really comes down to this. You need to philosophically understand what it means in your life to be successful as a pastor. Because it's not like running a Popeyes. It's not, we need to franchise out 5 more and, have 15 services. I mean, in a very real leadership way, we tend to, like, hang success over the numbers. And we know that that's a tight line we have to walk, because numbers do tell stories. We can make that argument, but, like, success in the most clear vein is, how obedient are you being to God in your call? And in that obedience, it's not necessarily about me even necessarily having the accolades. One of the most successful people in ministry I know on this planet is this lady. She is at our church. She's 87 years old. 3 days a week, she comes and walks around the church and prays for every staff member and every congregation she could think of by name. She's successful, she's successful. And I think what I'm hearing and what I wish I would have done, I always used to think success means you're running the thing, and once you're running the thing looks good. Now, we want to be excellence in everything we do, but, like, really our success as ministers, it is saying, I'm going to be obedient to God in this season of life, the way He's called me to be, and I'm going to trust Him with the results. So to me, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, to jump off of that, like,
yeah,
that obedience to God's calling on your life is super important when it comes to fighting what you feel are expectations from people in your church.
Man, yes.
Like, because you can just fall victim to being enslaved to what you think people's expectations of are of you in your church, as opposed to what God called you to do in that church. So, because I mean, in a small church like me, 50 people, I am constantly saying to myself, like, well, am I doing enough? Because so and so probably wants to have a class, and what about this? And I should be building this. And I just have to come back to, like, no, God has called me to do this specific thing in this church, make disciples, and He's called me to lead in my home. So, and I would say too, for young guys listening, like those of you that are youth pastors that are looking eventually at, but the possibility of senior pastorate, this needs to be a big part of the conversation when you interview.
Yes.
You need to have this in your mind when you're interviewing. What are your expectations? In our notes here, we have about our wives and our children. That is same thing. What are your expectations of my wife? If you're going to a smaller church that's older, they may assume she's going to play piano and run women's ministry. And you need to ask that question. Because now in my situation, this church amazingly, I've never had any of that pressure. And in past ministries, my wife was the children's director at like 3 of the churches I was the youth pastor at. So that's a whole nother story. But that whole thing of being the pastor's wife or the PK, they can experience some pressure that is difficult. And you need to ask those questions when you're interviewing.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Jeff. Growing up a PK myself, I now have 5 kids of my own who all identify as PKs. It's so important that they have a safe space to come to you and ask questions. I didn't have that in my house growing up. I was kind of scared to ask my parents certain things. Last week, my 9-year-old son came to me and said, "Daddy, is it okay if sometimes I don't like going to church?" Like, yep, sometimes Daddy doesn't like going to church. Like that is a very safe question to ask. So one thing that we try to do in my house is create those safe spaces where they know, hey, before they go to bed, I go into their rooms every night, and I usually try to spend just a couple minutes with each one of them and just kind of talk a little bit. And as they get older, those conversations are now very much more in depth and are now turning theological, which is a lot of fun for me. But it's fun to think about because I didn't necessarily have those types of conversations growing up as a PK, and seeing I was the youngest of 5, seeing my 3 older brothers essentially walk away from the church as a result of damage done to them through the church. There's a very soft spot in my heart for PKs and for protecting them. I love, Jeff, that you brought up the interview idea. I did that in my church setting. That was one of the first things I asked was, what do you expect of my wife and what do you expect of my kids? So we laid that foundation very, very early. It's still my hope and prayer that my wife and kids don't feel a whole lot of pressure to constantly have to do and be at the church all the time.
I want them to just feel like every other member.
No, I agree with you.
Like 100%. A highly involved member.
Mm-hmm. And then I also love how Andrew brought up the behind the scenes thing. That's a big deal for my kids. They get the behind the scenes on church life in a lot of ways. So
absolutely.
Del, you and I are very different because I 100% office from home now. So my sermon writing time is often done with my 3-year-old on my shoulders. And I've gotten used to it, and I can now do it pretty well. And every Saturday
That's pretty
night
awesome. I'm going to give you credit because that is actually that's an art what you're talking about right there.
So Saturday nights, for the last 3 weeks, my son has come in, and when I'm doing my final read through of my manuscript, and he says, "Dad, can I read a little bit of your sermon this week?" So every week he gets a preview of the sermon before it's preached. He just thinks that is the coolest thing. He gets access to it before somebody else does. So just those little bitty moments that we can
making
create.
Your kids feel like an insider. That's cool.
It's a lot of fun. And then the big thing for my wife and I, and this is the last thing here for us, is calendar syncing. That has been the number one communication piece for us in my home. We have a family calendar that my wife updates every month, and it details our stuff. And then my wife and I sync so my wife knows that I'm praying for Jose tomorrow at 11 o'clock on the phone. Like, that's how detailed she knows about my day. So we know exactly.
And she has veto power over his calendar.
She has veto power. So she has turned things down. Mm-hmm. I have given her full veto power over my calendar.
So okay. So what I'm gathering is really serving your family well as a pastor means you have to love them the way they need to be loved. Because I went and did that for my wife. I was like, let me cut on the calendar for you. She's like, sure. She comes to me next day. She goes, cut it off. Take it off now. My phone is going off every 15 minutes. Stop it from doing that. My battery is already dead. Stop it. So
that's funny.
That's why I have the little Sunday briefings. But I think it's kind of what you said. You're loving your wife the way she needs to be loved. I know for my wife, that means oftentimes I say no for her a lot so she doesn't have to. It's a way of loving. And then if she's going to say yes, I don't do that for her. I let her say yes. So
I think adapting to like your church's culture too is really important. Like,
oh gosh.
I know for me, like I'm in a smaller church. I'm the solo pastor. There's no other staff around. So on the one hand, like it means my schedule is whatever I want it to be. So and I don't mean this in a negative way, but I take advantage of that when it comes to like my family time. So like I can leave the office at 2 p.m. and go spend the afternoon in the park or whatever. As long as the work is getting done and the ministry is happening, like that's totally fine, because it's not about hours in its place. It's about shepherding the flock, and my family is part of that flock, but they're also a special piece of that flock that God has given me oversight of in a unique way, and so I'm going to spend extra time with them.
Guys, this was a really good conversation, and I was like, in my mind, I was like taking mental notes of things I wanted to add, and you guys all said the things I wanted you to say. Like, the one thing I was going to mention was like the whole interview process, and like one thing I always say, and it's not just senior pastor stuff. It's like every role in the church.
No, agreed.
If you're interviewing, you need to have this question ready. What's the expectation of my spouse? Because for most of us, the only expectation for a pastor's wife or a pastor's husband, I guess in some cases, a pastor's spouse, is to care and love for their spouse. And like that's their job. Their job doesn't need to be, and like one thing like I want to make sure is known as like, let's not just say in theory, yeah, they're free to do whatever they want. They don't have to do anything. But like in
Yes.
practice, they should be at every event. Like I have a friend who has lamented to me.
Unspoken expectations will kill you.
I have a friend who's lamented to me. He's a pastor in Florida, and his wife just had a second kid, and like they feel guilty because the pastors and the elders have said, "Why is your wife not here?" And he's like, she's raising 2 very, very young children. Like she's busy. She can't come to Wednesday night youth group study because she's at home caring for my kids, And so like stuff like that, it's like, man, I want to make sure that, and maybe we should do a whole episode on this, is talk about like job interview expectations and what you
That
should do,
would be
because
excellent.
It's a good topic.
because there's so many pastors who go into this with feeling like all the cards are in the church's hands, when majority of the cards are actually in your hands, and you should be probably asking a lot more questions than they are, because it's very easy for a church to hire the wrong candidate and then fire them. It's much harder to be a pastor getting hired by a wrong church and then feeling stuck.
I'm a product of my granddad's son. Hard working hands and a job well done. Skin as thick as railroad ties.